Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 175. Rewards. Dalcom felt a mighty impatience building up as he took his morning coffee. Brynbarn had been tracking the dummies for over 2 weeks. Despite that, there hadn't been a single sign of them meeting with a larger group. Having come out so far on Jonah's suggestion, he found the situation particularly irksome. The other man had been so certain a large gathering would take place. The kind that would surely have enough slaves to be taken to distinguish oneself. As it stood, the footsore group he'd been tracking would hardly be worth bringing back alive. All of which seemed about right to him. Jonas was pious to the point of being blind at times, but not someone Dalcom could ignore despite that. The clergy were fond of him, which made his suggestions all but orders. None of which made him other than someone who'd been a bit lucky and higher born than the rest of them. After his coffee and a biscuit, Dalcom signaled it was time to go. His men had broken camp at dawn and were eager enough to get moving. The rain had left them all cold, and without being able to make a proper fire, the best option to get warm was to get on the trail. Dummies tended to be good at woodcraft, and the group they were following wasn't an exception. If they'd been less tired, they'd have been difficult to track. As it was, it still wasn't easy. Things went fine for the first hour, but then took an odd turn. Dalcom's master of hound, Cullen, called a halt and came forward nervously. "Sir, I think there's something in these woods." "Dogs are actin' funny," Cullen explained. Dalcom wanted to cuff him, but it was pointless. Beating the man wouldn't make the dogs behave. He also knew better than to go after the animals themselves. There was no middle ground with the creatures. Anyone who wasn't their master trying to discipline them would not be tolerated. "Then get out of the way," Dalcom said flatly. He only had one tracker aside from Brynbarn, but Hilner knew his trade. He'd been a poacher before offering his services up to the Seekers. A smart move, since it came with a forgiveness of his past transgressions once he proved himself useful. He signaled for Hilner, who slunk over at a steady limp. The man had volunteered, but not before he'd been caught. The arrow through the leg that brought him down, partly laming him. "Cullen thinks there might be a monster in the woods," Dalcom said dismissively. Cullen bristled but didn't say anything. He was smart enough to know his place, even if he clearly didn't like it. "Bastards probably threw something down to foul the dogs. I ain't seen monster tracks." "Just dog," Hilner replied. He was always boringly matter-of-fact about things. "Maybe, but they're actin' scared," Cullen replied, thoughtful rather than upset. "Done that before, used piss," Hilner replied. "Monster piss?" "Because my dogs ain't scared of bears and such?" Cullen asked, clearly intrigued. Dalcom ran a hand over his face, wondering what he'd done to be cursed with such help. "I don't give a fuck, just get us back on the trail," Dalcom cut in to end the conversation. Both men looked at him in surprise. Cullen's expression turning into the kind you'd have if someone shat at the dinner table. His deep offense at having his little discussion of the trade interrupted clearly written across his features. Hilner thankfully turned and went to work. It took a not inconsiderable amount of backtracking, but he found tracks after a while. The group had changed course after fouling the dogs, which made sense. It also suggested they thought they were being tracked, but Hilner had indicated they were still slow going. They might have simply done it because they found whatever was used to do it. That, or they being a bit paranoid, unwilling to risk being followed before they found somewhere to rest for a few days. Dalcom supposed there was an outside chance that they might actually be meeting up with another group. Not much of one, but the change did tell him something different was happening at the very least. Regardless, it suggested caution was in order. Once it was found, following the trail was simple enough. They even found Brynbarn's camp from the prior night, including the remains of a small fire. Dalcom made a personal decision not to have the man whipped for it after they were done. It might have been why the dummies changed course, but it had been raining and Brisbane hadn't been that close to them. They likely hadn't seen it. Though even if they had, it didn't change that they should be careful. Brisbane himself had kept on tracking, apparently not forgetting his duty outright. He didn't leave any intentional signs, but he wasn't exactly stealthy despite his tracking skills. His path behind the dummies was easy to follow. It was nearing noon when they found themselves traveling near a cliff edge. The steep stony side towering above additional forest. Dalcom glanced over the edge occasionally, curious if Brisbane hadn't wandered over the side accidentally in the dark. They didn't know when the man had begun tracking, and it would have been possible in the gloom of the early morning if he wasn't careful. There was no sign of anyone below, human or otherwise. Dalcom put the fanciful idea aside along with happy little visions of the men who annoyed him wandering over the edge. He'd volunteered for a command role because he'd thought it would be easier to give orders than take them. He hadn't counted on the headache of trying to get everyone under him to listen. Finally Hilner signaled a halt and came to Dalcom holding a strip of white cloth in his hands. A seeker's sign. How was it tied? Dalcom asked. Round a bush, Hilner replied. What kind of knot? Dalcom asked. He had to remind himself that Hilner was a bit slow. Hilner just stared back at him. Like you were shown, seeker signs. Dalcom reminded him. Not that many of them ever used them, but everyone was taught at some point. Trackers employed them frequently and were expected to know them from memory without needing a guide. The tied kind. Hilner finally said. Dalcom got his hand half raised before he could stop himself. He didn't need smart men, but he had thought he at least had ones with basic competence. Fucking idiot, show me where you found it, Dalcom said finally. Hilner hadn't even flinched at the upraised hand, just looked at it with a dull curiosity. He complied with the order with a similar level of enthusiasm. The bush the strip of cloth had been tied to was next to a narrow trail leading down the cliff face. Too tight for horses. It would have been easy to miss without the sign. Down in the woods below Dalcom could see a bit of white, Brynbarn in his seeker's cloak instead of the green one meant for tracking. Dalcom paused a moment, taking the scene in. Brynbarn was too far away to make out clearly, but he was leaning against a tree, probably smoking, rather than tracking. Either he'd lost the trail or he was confident it wouldn't matter. Searching the treetops, Dalcom spotted several thin lines of smoke rising up from a sizable clearing. It was far enough off that he couldn't get a real feel for anything about it, but it suggested a large encampment. Word was quickly passed around to leave all but the most basic of gear with the horse and tie them up in the woods. They could have tried to find a wider trail down, but Dalcom didn't want to risk losing his chance by fucking about looking for a better option. Besides, they'd have to tie them up anyway before trying to get close enough for an attack. Only Cullen balked at the prospect of heading down, not wanting to travel where his dogs wouldn't go. Dalcom finally lost his temper and cuffed him. Master of Hounds was too good a title for a wet-behind-the-ears brat without the courage Strom gave a rat. Guard the horses then, Dalcom sneered. The dogs would have been a liability anyway, but he'd thought to let the boy blood himself. He wasn't even properly a seeker yet, having been conscripted rather than volunteering. He should have wanted to prove himself, but he continually did the bare minimum. Dalcom wouldn't try to do him any favors again. The cliff trail was narrow but easy to walk down, and there was a bit of a clearing at the bottom. Enough for everyone to rally while they waited for Brisbane to come and report. Half of his men were down and the rest on the trail when the earth gave a sudden grinding groan. Dalcom didn't have time to do more than look about in confusion before everything went dark. Chapter 176. Loose Ends. Elim watched the cliff come down and couldn't help but wince. He didn't honestly care for the method. The killing was one thing, but he didn't want to leave anyone buried and suffocating. Any of them alive? Elim asked. Marlowe cocked his head and there was a tremor, then stillness. No, Marlowe said simply. The hound hadn't cared about leaving them to suffer, so it was a favor to Elim and his apparently more delicate sensibilities. Elim reached down with a gauntlet hand to give Marlowe a proper scritch in thanks. It wasn't as if he didn't understand the hound's lack of an interest in the seeker's fate. Anything he saw as an obstacle was dealt with as soon as convenient and with as little fuss as possible. A natural mindset to have in his case. Elim's own thoughts on the point were messy, but not that different nor truly kinder. Leaving someone to suffer was cruel, but also sloppy. People could survive surprising things. It was better to be sure you'd ended someone if you decided to. Efficiency and mercy were closer kin than most liked to admit. Any more up top, he added. He could see a small figure up on the ridge, looking down. He hoped there weren't too many more. Marlowe was powerful, but his abilities were better suited to an ambush, not direct combat. A limping man, and that, not quite a man, no longer a pup, Marlowe offered. Elim looked up at the not a pup. A kid, and likely the one Marlowe had mentioned being in charge of the dogs. Elim considered what he was going to do about the two remaining seekers. Reasonably he'd have killed them on principle if they still posed a threat to the retreating Lepusan. He couldn't see just two of them being an issue though. Not with Ban and Ewan being there to protect their people. He sent 42 a text about the situation. She'd get back to him eventually, but he considered his options in the meantime. Do you wish to track them? Marlowe asked. Nah, hopefully the kid is smart enough to burn that cloak and run. If he's not, well, he'll be coming back with reinforcements, Aleem said with a shrug. Reinforcements? Marlowe inquired. More of his kind. 42 needs points though, so I don't imagine she'll mind, Aleem explained. He didn't really know what points were, just that she got them from killing. Something he'd overheard while she was talking to someone else during one of their calls. It had been Chris who'd been happy to explain the details. That and speculate on how many Aleem himself might have been worth. And the man? Marlowe asked. Leave him, if the kid doesn't go for them, he probably will, Aleem decided. Thinking of Chris, he felt an eye twitch. He didn't mind Bess becoming a rogue if that suited her. He just hoped it was one of the others that mentored her in the class rather than that foul-mouthed little Blackheart. Aleem wouldn't even say he particularly minded Chris himself, and he certainly didn't question his skills. The way the other rogues at the training area stepped lightly around him was proof enough that he was formidable. It was just the idea of Bess picking up Chris's manners that sent an unpleasant shiver down Aleem's back. If that happened, he was sure his mother was going to be sore at him for the rest of his days. The boy is leaving with his hounds, Marlowe offered after a bit. Aleem nodded and headed for the cliff. Once the kid was gone, Marlowe made a new path up and he busied himself with collecting the horses. 42 wouldn't need them, the breeds weren't anything special, but Aleem wasn't about to leave the poor creatures tied in the middle of nowhere. He could figure out what exactly he was going to do with them later. The brands being distinctly foreign made it easier to sell them if he decided to. It was still technically theft to take them, but so long as he handled it right it wouldn't come to anything. The seekers shouldn't have been in Dreadmore and their claim to the animals wouldn't be recognized. Though thinking about it he supposed that healing a brand was something 42 could probably do if she put her mind to it. Aleem wasn't particularly interested in getting into horse trading, but being able to move the one had or might acquire later more easily had its appeal. He sent 42 a text asking about it, but made clear it wasn't a priority of any kind. She was likely busy and he didn't want her rushing to answer when she didn't need to. Let's get on with things, Aleem said as he returned to his own horse. Lily was likely the prettiest quarter horse he'd ever seen, let alone owned. Smart too, thanks to some kind of thing 42 did to her and the other livestock she'd gotten her hands on. Another reason she wouldn't need the ones he'd found. She could make better. Where to next? Marlowe inquired as they set off at an easy pace. Back to the clearing, Storm will be around before long. I think I'll ask Tiller to scout for more seekers, just in case, Aleem explained. The two he'd let go weren't a threat, but it wouldn't hurt to double-check if there were more in the area or not. Hard to pick up or not, he didn't want anyone catching the Lepusan's trail again. Or stumbling on it through sheer bad luck either. He is a useful nuisance, Marlowe conceded. Despite his efforts to the contrary. You'd think he'd be sweeter since he's always begging for food, Aleem said with a shake of his head. The demonic hawk's ill temper was at odds with his goal on a good day and outright counterproductive most of the time. Aleem could have easily added a couple of snakes to the inventory to make it easy to give the bird treats. He was just so awful that the thought never crossed Aleem's mind. Tiller had laughed pretty hard when he'd told her about that one, agreeing that she wouldn't be rewarding the bastard either. Perhaps Tiller should join us. It would be easier to hunt together, Marlowe offered, shaking Aleem from his thoughts. I suppose so, Aleem mused. Things had been a little awkward between them since arriving in the valley. Nothing was wrong exactly, but he kept waiting for her to tell him she'd made a deal with 42. He wasn't even mad about it, just at a loss for what exactly would come after. Aside from courting her anyway. Aleem felt a bit out of sorts, but he hadn't changed his mind about that. Really he supposed he just wanted that part of things over with so they could figure it out. The suspense of it was what was getting to him. Good, this forest has pretty gems. You can renew your courting properly, Marlowe said, tail up and wagging happily. Renew it properly? Aleem asked with a chuckle. Marlowe yapped and made a gnashing expression with his muzzle. You spend too much time licking her, as if she were already digging a den for your pups, Marlowe said, baying with laughter. Aleem felt his face catch fire with embarrassment. Things were a bit awkward, but that hadn't stopped them sneaking the odd kiss on the sly. Or what he'd assumed had been the sly, he'd had no idea Marlowe had seen any of that. Kindly don't go spying on that in the future, Aleem said stiffly. There won't be anything to see if you don't win her over, Marlowe countered. With that the hound went running, baying in amusement again. Chapter 177. Waiting. After Aleem confirmed the Lepusan band was inbound, things were relatively quiet. Tiller left to join him. She neither asked for my permission nor needed it, but I found it curious. She'd seemed quite keen on a deal with me initially but hadn't brought it up since coming to the valley. I didn't care either way, though I'd make one if she asked again. It just had me wondering if she was waiting for me to bring the subject up first. To keep busy I asked Harry about what sort of environment her people preferred. She hadn't cared much for being left behind while Ban, Yuan, and Joss left, but had warmed to the task. Those were the ones with the ability to dig burrows and she had some very specific ideas about what kind of ground was acceptable. I provided a little bit of that in the town and some further into the valley. Nothing out of place, though it did require a bit of nighttime modification and careful blending to make it work. The majority of it would be on the opposite side of the mountain in the forest. It was naturally occurring there so it didn't need a lot of work or explanation. Good enough, Harry said after drumming her foot on a patch of dirt. It had been going like a jackhammer, checking for instability and cavities. She'd elected to investigate the patch I'd placed among a copse of trees near the river, just off from the halfling burrows. Mind if I get to it then? Harry asked. Be my guest, I offered. I wasn't entirely sure what she meant. We'd only discussed soil and things she'd look for in a proper site. Lapusan didn't build in a framework like halflings did. I wasn't sure what she'd need for the next phase. Harry nodded and then dropped on all fours and started digging with her hands. My mouth fell open as I started to say something then failed to think of what. I'd thought we'd discuss tools and things, but that didn't appear to be needed the way she was going. Once she was in deep enough to start employing her back legs the dirt really started flying. Seeing that she was in her element, I backed off. It would be easy for me to offer help later if she needed it. Crowding her now or insisting I could do things better wouldn't be a smart move. 2 weeks passed easily like that. I worked with various groups to get them settled in more comfortably, be they skeleton or mortal, and waited for the arrival of new residents. The folks on the farm were largely content with living in the bunkhouse there, though 2 of the families had elected to move into homes in the town. They'd been surprised how easy it was to make the arrangements and about the option to buy the properties. I'd had to do a little song and dance about the town being run down and in need of people because of the dungeon. Some of the men worked as gathers in the dungeon on the side, but most worked on the farm for the moment. Erica drew a line at house servants though. She wasn't noble and had grown accustomed to doing things on her own. Help wasn't taken amiss nor was chore sharing, but she didn't need or want to be coddled as she would have been as lady of her father's house. It took some restating of boundaries, but things were sorting themselves out. My only suggestion being to break up certain things into businesses and share the money from them with those who worked there. Silvertree cider and mead seemed like a given since Erica kept bees and adding an orchard wouldn't be difficult on the opposite side of the mountain. I'd made a mistake in not including more fruit trees on the farm but the amount was probably already a bit sketchy. I'd had to add an irrigation system for them to explain why they didn't just shrivel up and die. An unexpected perk of my increased sociability, or possibly just time spent above ground, was that it was getting easier. I still felt uncomfortable in my true form, but not nearly as much as I had. Moving around as do had been easier from the start but now I could do it without issue. Since Elim had broken off from the Lepusan group I wasn't getting frequent updates on them. Tiller had kept tabs on them for the first week until she joined up with them and they switched focus to hunting for seekers. They'd been fine though and were close enough by the time she stopped that I didn't think trouble was likely. They'd likely appear soon, and I made a point of visiting Harry to check on her progress. I didn't technically need to, I could just look at my map and had, but it seemed neighborly. Harry? How are things going? I called down one of the holes she'd been digging. The warren was coming together from what I understood. It had a number of semi-private sleeping chambers and a central area along with a sheltered back exit. Miss Mayor? Come see for yourself. Harry called back up. I descended at her invitation, knowing not calling out first was a sure way to get a face full of dirt. I had to get on all fours to make it through the entry tunnel but then the main area opened up to a comfortable height. Tree roots wove a mat overhead that formed the ceiling. It's bigger than last time, I offered. Trying to aesthetically complement a dugout would have sounded forced so I didn't bother. This is a lucky sort of patch to find. Usually you can only dig a family warren but this is almost big enough for a clan, Harry said cheerfully. She was covered from the tips of her ears down to her toes in dirt and didn't seem to mind it a bit. Like the other one? I asked. I'd made the one in town smaller. Oh, even that's rather large. You could fit 4 to 6 families easily if everyone is friendly, Harry said, laughing. I take it you don't usually do a lot in them then, I said, a bit surprised. It was probably just my otherworldly sensibilities, but I wouldn't have enjoyed being crammed in like she was suggesting was the norm. Bunkering down against the cold together made sense despite that. Not unless it's winter, and then you mostly sleep if it's too cold to go out. Don't know if that's how it's always been or not, my mother only taught me the basics, Harry explained. I bit back on a question, knowing damn well there was a sad story attached to basically everything she'd said. A sad story that was none of my business to ask about. Well, let me know if you need anything or want to try something different. I've got plenty of stone and wood if you want to try adapting one of the other styles of building at some point, I offered. It was up to the Lepusan themselves if they wanted to incorporate other techniques. I wasn't going to push now that I'd made the offer clear. No, this is good to start. Though the elders might have some ideas. The only thing I still need to do is get to the provisioning, but it'll keep until after I try my hand at that gathering work, Harry explained. Provisioning? I asked. Oh, laying in stores for winter and such. I'm not going to do all of it, but I should get it started for when the others arrive. It'll help them feel safe, Harry said, gesturing vaguely around the space. You know, I appreciate you wanting to work for it, but with the number of people coming, I'd really like to help, I offered. I could be gentler with this than I was with Ban when he left the valley. Harry and the new Lepusan wouldn't be outside of my area of influence if something went wrong and they needed things. That's kind of you, Harry said, pensive. I couldn't blame her for wanting to look a gift horse in the mouth. Not after what she and her people had been through. Hardly, getting people back in this town is a blessing in my book. I'm happy to do whatever's needed to make it a comfortable place to live, I said honestly. But don't feel pressured. Take your time and think about it. I'll do just that, Harry said, relaxing. I nodded politely and had to school my expression into a friendly mask. A non-hostile entry pop-up had just appeared and I could detect incoming along the mountain path. It had to be the Lepusan, but I couldn't let my glee show. You know what, let's go have lunch. You've been working almost non-stop, I said. Anything to get her into the town so she'd be there when her people arrived and save me having to send messengers and other nonsense. Oh, I mean, Harry started to demur. She gestured at her dirt-covered herself as explanation. Nothing a good shake and a dip in the river can't fix, I countered. She still didn't look convinced, though her conviction was waning. We'll have to stop at the pastry shop too, of course, I added, deploying the nuclear option. Well, I wouldn't want to be rude by refusing, Harry said brightly. She was out of the entry hole and into the water before I had time to do more than shield my face from flying dirt. Chapter 178. Faith. Though the band was closer than Ban had assumed they'd been when he left, it still took time to get them to the valley. 4 weeks, though they were remarkably trouble-free. The carts led the way. Those able-bodied enough to walk the full day were faster, so it set an easy pace and kept them all together. They avoided the post town under the cover of night. The bounty was fresh on Ban's mind. They had numbers enough, but it was foolish to trust that alone when coin was involved. No one questioned the choice, the presence of humans enough to make them wary. The foothills were easier to traverse than the desert, but were hard going for the carts at certain points. Thankfully they didn't have to abandon them until they were close to the valley. Those who had to be were carried and the mules and equipment brought with them. Ban intended to return everything he could to 42. Even the carts could be salvaged later with a bit of work. Finally they made it, the green valley standing out among the pink and orange stone cliffs it nestled within. The entire band went quiet then, taking all in with awe. Ban, hold, Artem called. Some of the other elders were holding the others back as well, though Gretch was ambling along. Anyone who tried to get between her and where she was going to get a walloping from her walking stick. Right, why? Ban asked, looking the elders over. They were calm but not in good spirits, ears half back. We want to see the temple first, Artem explained. That's fine, it's not far from the path. Trouble is, you're thinking something I won't like, Ban said, voice even with an effort. He'd seen the elders like this before as they pronounced verdicts. Hard decisions that had to be made, but came at dear costs. Nothing so terrible, though you may well dislike it, Jala agreed. They don't want all of us to go down, just a few. They mean for the entire band to leave after we get supplies. They've set themselves on the wilderness, Celis explained. The other elders glared at her for it. There's too much of a risk, Ban. They'll likely act nice enough now, but they might sell us out or worse, Artem said quickly. They killed the seekers chasing us. Say whatever else you like, but they won't sell us to Stromhold and they're the only ones buying, Joss said with a scoff. Even so, Jala said. Even so? What? You don't trust Hecha, our own kin, and you won't even let the band see this place despite us vouching for it. Yuan demanded bitterly. A rare thing for him. Easy, Ban said, holding up a hand to the pair. The band was nervous and likely to do as they were told even if they didn't agree. They were used to accepting decisions made for the good of the group out of necessity. There's wisdom in taking this slow, and not all of us have to go at once, Ban conceded. Yuan looked at him hard for that, but he curled his fingers to silently ask the other buck's patience. But it's not my place, nor yours, to insist on a course of action beyond that. Let everyone who wants to see the valley do so while we all rest a while. We can hold a full council later, talk about our options, Ban offered. Ban, we're better off away from everyone else, Artem said, shaking his head. Not just humans, everyone. Ban wanted to sigh but kept it in. The elders could be more fretful as their fur grayed, but Artem had always been the most cautious. It shouldn't have been a surprise that he wanted to simply hide. Ban recoiled at the idea, but kept it to himself. Even if they hadn't been able to make alliances with other beast folk like themselves, they should have brought the Lepusan clans together. It might not have changed things too much, the chaining had been sudden, but it might have. At the very least they wouldn't have been so isolated in the years since. Perhaps, but unless I've missed something, you know less about the wilderness than we do about this place. We don't even have a map of what's past the mountains or know where it's safest to cross or when. Rest, plan, then we'll talk about it, Ban said firmly. Well said, Gretch said as she passed Ban. She tapped his shoulder approvingly with her walking stick but didn't bother stopping. Now, show me this temple while I still have eyes to see it. Laughter went up at that and tension eased though the elders didn't look pleased. Ban shrugged, turning to hurry after Gretch and fell in beside her. Yes Gran, I'll take you, Ban said. Gretch gave him a wallop with the stick for that. You're no kid of my clan less Harry says you are, Gretch grumbled good-naturedly. I'll do my best to convince her, Ban said earnestly. He'd had courting on his mind for a while but it wouldn't have been any wiser for him and Harry than the others. The road was hard, but if they stayed in the valley then they would have options. See that you do, Gert grumbled, playfully menacing for a moment. Though the rest of the band wasn't in full accord about what would come after, all of them followed. The prospect of seeing a temple to Laurel was too enticing for even the most cautious among them to refuse. Ban found the boulder-strewn path easy enough and quickly brought them to the broad stairs. On each side there was a guardian statue, bicorns with their curled ram-like horns carved so lifelike he half expected them to blink and snort. They remained still though, glaring balefully as they watched the group ascend. There were 3 pairs in total with strange bushes between them and planters lined with benches. It was an easy walk to the fountain courtyard. Ban's breath caught on seeing it again and all of the beautiful carvings that line its walls. He'd been in awe the first time he found it and would have considered it more than enough had it been all that there was to see. Don't forget to bring Harry to see after this, Gert said softly, eyes wet with tears. I will, but this isn't the temple, it's the entrance, Ban said with a grin. Walking to the doors that looked like elaborate carvings he pushed and they swung open silently. He let the others enter first and take it all in. The hall, the great fountain, Laurel's statue towering above. He'd gone in the late evening to avoid being seen and not been able to discern much detail. Just enough to know that Hecha had been telling the truth. Now the chamber was much more brightly lit, sunlight filtering in from above to highlight the statue and throwing dappled light about the room. In the hush only the murmur of the fountain could be heard, as if everyone hardly dared breath let alone speak. After long moments they began to kneel one by one, paying homage to the goddess. Chapter 179. Shifting Concerns. It was late afternoon in my palace of shadows when I decided that I did in fact like the cluster and scattering of fang-like crystals I'd added to the ceiling. I'd been playing around with lightstones and figured out how to add a kind of timer function. Embedding them in the formation allowed it to brighten and dim throughout the day and give me a sense of the time on the surface. Not exactly a critical feature, but it allowed me to be a bit more in touch without needing a clock. It also looked really cool, which was reason enough. It was one of 100 little busy work projects I'd been adding to the environment between larger projects or when I was low on inspiration. Something which happened more frequently since Elim had split from the Lepusan. I wasn't worried per se, they were all survivors, but I was definitely getting anxious. I had no way of checking up on them before they reached the valley nor helping if something happened. An acute reminder of my limitations despite the power I held in the dungeon. Ugh! Not a single adventurer. Chris groaned from the couch. He'd been hanging out since late morning. Though I'd added more spaces to the palace, Chris still liked to come in and claim one of the couches in the main entry. I wasn't sure if he was just used to it since that had been the only space once, or something else. He was allowed back into the more personal areas, but hadn't shown an interest. Not that I spent a lot of time in them either. Most of my private space was storage of one kind or another as I didn't sleep. It was more interesting to hang out in the sitting area. I usually left the main doors open to invite company and the denizens to come talk about dungeon matters. Most texted if it were work-related, but I usually had a fairly steady stream of visitors. They don't just fall from trees, Chris, I grumbled back. He'd been bitching on and off for a while, his book half forgotten though not far from his hand. Yeah, but you put out postings and such. Someone should have turned up by now. Chris countered. I just shrugged. I definitely wanted to establish a decent stream of people to keep up with my tith. I'd put in the work to make it happen, but I couldn't say when it would bear fruit and I wasn't exactly hurting for points. I really think you need a hobby, I needled. Most of the skeletons had decided to improve old skills or pick up new ones when they got skill resets. Chris hadn't, and I felt like that was part of why he was as bored as he was. That and being a teenager. It seemed to be a chronic issue for him that didn't bother the older skeletons. I've got one. Chris countered. Causing trouble isn't a hobby, I countered. Whatever he said next was lost as a frisson went through me a moment before a non-hostile entry alert appeared. I pulled up the footage of the Lupson entering the valley. I watched the disagreement and immediately sent out a general alert. They weren't to be interfered with until they came down on their own. I turned to find that Chris was staring at the footage. He'd snuck up on me at some point, another hobby of his. I'd left the window open though I hadn't been paying much attention. Not since they found the temple. I'd wanted them to, but how they would use it was up to them. They have little ones with them, Chris observed, staring at the screen. There were 6 Lepusan kits in the group. They do, I agreed. They shouldn't sleep out in the hills then, he added softly, like he was talking to himself. I ruffled his hair and he skittered away like an indignant cat. Don't do that, it'll look funny. Chris growled. He stormed over to the mirror I kept forgetting to take down. I considered asking who he was concerned about looking good for, but didn't. He was already in a huff now, asking anything related to Andrea would only make him pout. Maybe some of the Lepusan will join the school, I offered. So what if they do? Chris asked, fussing with his hair. I didn't bother pointing out that it would reset itself. The illusion was good, but it didn't retain changes like the real thing would. Read-in's fine, but he cut off. His hair had returned to its usual style. The other one, for the adults, I clarified. The Adventurer School didn't have a more official name, but it existed. Chris looked his hair over critically before heading back to the couch. He spared me a glare as he did. It won't exactly make them adventurers overnight, Chris pointed out. No, but you could train those interested in being a rogue, I offered. It wasn't the first time I'd brought the idea up, but I hadn't pressed it before. There hadn't been a point without any students likely to appear soon. Even now I couldn't guarantee anyone would want to take up his class, but it was a bit more likely. I'll think about it, Chris said. That's all I ask, I replied. He'd calmed down a bit since he was first summoned once I added entertainment to the dungeon. Having Andrea to train with had calmed him down more but added some mood swings to the mix. I hoped that having a new regular activity he enjoyed would help even him out a bit more. Playing with Blackmoor and Stalin's puppies helped a little with that but created new issues. The hounds were fun and I enjoyed their company, but he was a bit too isolated for my taste. Not as bad as Aaron, but still on his own too much overall. I hadn't told him any of that, nor did I intend to. There was no way in hell he'd take being managed like that well. Very few people would, even if they enjoyed the results. Chris didn't say anything when he got up to go, only waving a goodbye because I noticed. I waved back, not minding. I took it as him feeling comfortable and a little distracted. Normally he would have been part of Andrea's combat lessons. A sparring partner, even if I found the idea a bit dubious. For the moment though she was working on her class abilities exclusively. I turned back to the footage of the Lepusan praying to their goddess. The elders were reluctant to stay, but I wasn't worried. They were in a sorry state and obviously in need of rest no matter what they said. They wouldn't be leaving quickly. I'd woo the group rather than insist. A task I'd get help with from Ban and Harry. Both wanted what was best for their people and would go with them if it came to that, but neither wanted to leave. They'd help convince them to stay, which was a plus. My mind drifted from that practical issue almost immediately since it would have to wait. In the meantime, I was glad that I didn't have any appointments with Harry. It would have been hard to see her but not tell her about her people arriving. Playing the Hermit and Giant Kin cards gave me room for fantastic abilities I didn't have to explain, but there were limits. Or at least I felt like there would be. Small mysteries were one thing. If I overplayed things, eventually questions would be asked or I'd do something that didn't fit with what people believed I should be able to do. I let out an aggravated sigh. Not even an hour earlier I'd been frustrated about not knowing what was happening with the Lepusan. Now I was worrying about how to behave around them. A more pleasant worry to have certainly, but vexing in its own right. Rather than ruminate further, I opened my to-do list. Seeing it grounded me in the reality of all the shit I still needed to do. It was time to get back to work. Chapter 180. Point of view. Jala didn't appreciate being chosen to go into the town by the other elders. It was proof they thought her obedient, unlike Gretch and Celis, who'd gone on without waiting to discuss the matter. That and possibly that her knees were better since she was the youngest among them. You shouldn't have to do this, Tella muttered in worry. She'd chosen to help get provisions and bring them back to the band. It was a brave choice, but it seemed like it had taken all of her courage to do it. I was asked and didn't refuse, Jala said evenly. Like it or not, she'd agreed. So had the two bucks accompanying them. Really, she'd have refused if her skills weren't needed. They needed medicinal plants though, and hopefully the seeds for them too. They'd be important to make the elders plan to settle in the wilderness work. You're our only midwife, Tella said too loud. Yuan looked back at them and then away in embarrassment. They were still among their own rather than strangers, but it wasn't a good thing to advertise. The more skilled had been targeted first during the chaining. Mind yourself, Jala said sternly. Without anyone pregnant in the band, she was the one with the least work to do. Tella's ears drooped dejectedly. The rest of the trip into town passed quietly and remained so because aside from Ban and Yuan, everyone was too shocked to speak. The buildings were fancy enough to belong to merchants or nobles. They were all 2 stories and had windows. Most were paper, but a few were even glass. The cloudy bubbled stuff that was beyond expensive even in small amounts. It was a shock to say the least. That everything seemed well kept and was painted in pretty colors only added to the surreal feeling of the matter. Even the streets and walkways were wide with pavers in the orange and pink hues of the surrounding cliffs. They contrasted against the frequent shady green spaces. Between the look of things and the unexpected quiet, it felt like they'd wandered into an elaborate garden rather than a town. The town folks themselves were few and far between. Only a trickle of them were on the streets or congregated around the shops and fountains. Nice, eh? Ban asked with a hint of a grin as they walked. Jala turned up her chin at that but didn't refute his words. It was pretty at the very least. More to the point, it seemed Ban was right that the town had lost many of its citizens. Citizens that, as he'd said, didn't seem entirely human. The bouncy little halflings seemed to be like them, beastkin of some kind, though she didn't know what. The short broad ones Ban identified as dwarves were human-like but built very differently and smelled of earth and metals like an elemental might. The elves were more varied, pointed ears and thinner builds being the only truly common feature among them. They too smelled of nature and the elements in a way humans wouldn't. Those most human in appearance clearly weren't entirely. They had strangely vivid eyes, some seeming almost to glow. A feature which would have been sufficient enough to have them reduced to slaves during the chaining along with the Lepusan and other beast folk. The strangest thing though was the quiet and the scent of the place. Jala could hear people talking but they weren't loud in the ways she was accustomed to. The place also smelled mostly of nature and food rather than waste like most towns would. Even Lepusan communities couldn't avoid that so well despite trying. It was strange despite its pleasantness. Rather than go to any shop or seek out someone, Ban guided them all to the green at the heart of the town. A pretty spot with benches and tables aplenty as well as a few peddlers selling trinkets and food. Ban and Yuan went over to them, leaving Jala with a moment to think. Jala couldn't be certain yet that she had the full count, but the band didn't seem so badly outnumbered as she'd expected. They'd make up a decent amount of the town's population if they stayed, enough that they couldn't be ignored in decision-making if it were done fairly. She shook the idea off, knowing that rarely were such things fair even if they weren't as bad as things in Stromholt. Power was not easily obtained even in small matters. That was when Ban and Yuan returned with platters of roasted vegetables and loaves of hot herbal bread. What exactly is the plan? Jala asked, not touching the food. She was hungry, but she wanted information more than a full belly. Well, to wait. The townsfolk will have let the mayor know we're back by now and she'll send someone, Ban explained. And we don't go to her ourselves, why? Jala asked. It wasn't exactly strange to wait on a summons. She was just a bit confused as to why they weren't expected to wait somewhere like the town hall. Ah, well, she gets around and likely isn't there since we don't have an appointment. So here's as good a place as any, Ban explained. The logic of it didn't exactly track for Jala, but she shrugged and decided to just eat. Seeing how the mayor responded to the unusual choice would be telling. With the first bite, Jala had regrets. The food was absolutely delicious and it took an effort for her to finish it with any kind of decorum rather than just wolf it down. The bucks had no such issues and ate at a nearly alarming pace. Ban and Yuan didn't comment, just getting more after a bit and letting everyone at the table eat their fill. As they all sat full and content for the moment, a man approached. He looked mostly human with unnaturally intense blue eyes. His were the kind that almost seemed to glow. They stood out against his otherwise common features. Tan skin, middling height, longer brown curly hair, and a sturdy but thin build. He had an odd scar over one eye, but scars were hardly rare. His clothes were different from the other townsfolk though, done all in black, blue, and silver. Fancier with a matching broad-brimmed hat and a symbol on the right breast of his coat. A blue rose with a pair of silver swords crossed behind it, though one of the swords looked only partly finished. It had to be a noble crest marking him as one or the servant of such a person. Jala hardly needed to see the slim sword at his hip to feel herself start to freeze in fear. People like him had worked with the Seekers and came for them during the chaining. Ban got up and intercepted the man a few paces from the table thankfully. Jala could keep her fear in check, but the bucks were looking like they were only a hair off drumming in warning. As much as she wasn't keen on staying, they needed supplies. Starting a fight wasn't going to make getting them easier. Ban, I'm glad to see you return safely, the man said cheerfully. Henry. Good to see you again, Ban said, getting up to clasp wrists. Dawn and Icarus asked me to invite you to dinner at the guild this evening, Henry added. Jala didn't know anyone named and kept quiet for the moment. That's kind of them, Ban said neutrally. Hardly, everyone who doesn't feel like CO cooking dines there or the inn, Henry offered with a laugh. He looked the group over for a moment, a brow raising. Jala expected he'd ask after where the rest of the band was. Joss already off making trouble? Henry asked. Joss? Tella asked in surprise. Jala wanted to sigh but kept it in. She was well aware that Joss was an up-jumped kid and prone to causing trouble. Tella though had eyes for him and was prone to take offense on his behalf. Unlike before when Henry ignored the group, he turned to the table. He took all of them in with his strange eyes but his expression didn't change much. Pardon madam, I'm Henry James Clavicle, at your service, Henry offered with a little bow. Henry, this is Tella and beside her is Jala. The bucks are Adam and Dowlin, Ban offered. Jala, Tella, Adam, Dowlin, Henry replied. He offered Jala the deepest bow and the bucks shallower ones, which she could admit was a little amusing. Normally it went the other way around from what little she'd seen of the custom. Not to rush things, but is there any chance the mayor can see us today? Ban asked once the greetings were done. You needn't worry about that, she'll be in the town hall in an hour or so, Henry explained. Why not now? Tella asked. She seemed a little confused rather than hostile, but Jala could see trouble brewing as she asked the innocent question. The bucks were already on edge and Adam fancied her. He stood up and was half a head taller and much sturdier than the human man. Worse than simply menacing him from the spot, he stepped toward Henry and into the man's space. And who are you to tell us that? Adam demanded. He clearly saw the moment as an opportunity to impress Tella. Jala regretted letting him come along, but he was one of the strongest of the bucks. She'd been thinking practically and forgotten to consider their delicate situation as fully as she should have. The mayor is presently occupied with. Henry started speaking like Adam hadn't moved. It wasn't until the young buck tried to put a hand on him that he did. There was a faint flash of blue and suddenly Adam folded, sitting back down on the bench. Henry had him by the paw, holding a digit oddly. The lady asked me a question, Henry said sternly as he let go. Adam clutched his paw but just nodded, wincing but not in pain so bad as to howl. As I was saying, the mayor was alerted when you entered the town. She's presently busy with finishing gathering supplies for your people, as she agreed to do when she last spoke with Ban, Henry explained calmly. He gave Tella another little bow as he finished. As for who I am? Henry James Clavicle, tailor by trade, Henry explained. Most people would lead with being an iron-ranked member of the guild, Ban said flatly. I prefer to be known for my passions, Henry replied, gesturing to his clothes. I have to go, but please enjoy yourselves. Jala just nodded as did the others aside from Adam. She didn't know how strong an iron-ranked adventurer was meant to be, but clearly they were formidable. She couldn't help but wince as Henry started to leave only to pause beside Adam and put a hand on the young buck's shoulder. If he decided to hurt him or worse, there wasn't anything to be done. A lady rarely enjoys brutishness from a man. Think a little more before you act next time, Henry said, stern again. He patted Adam's shoulder before continuing on his way. Jala got up and quickly inspected Adam's paw. No damage had been done thankfully. She let out a relieved sigh then cuffed Adam right on the ear. Ah! Why? Adam asked, curling in pain. Because you deserve it, idiot, Jala said bluntly. He could have been harmed or worse, not to mention causing a fight might have cost them the supplies they needed. Be glad she did, else I'd have, Ban added with a glare. That man is the mayor's buck. Adam curled further and just nodded, paws up to protect his sensitive ears. The rest of the group looked at each other. It wasn't a slight to send a messenger rather than appear herself. The mayor sending her man though was a sign of respect among their own people. That Adam had challenged a buck of such standing and only been dealt a warning was a further courtesy they didn't know how to interpret. Jala sighed, she felt like the strangeness would only intensify when they finally got to meet the mayor herself. Chapter 181. First Impressions. Adam kept his ears and eyes down as they made their way to the town hall. Tella hadn't spared him any sympathy and despite everything he understood he didn't deserve it. Like the human had said, he should have thought before he acted. His family had been among the last affected by the chaining so he'd grown up in the forest in a comfortable if small burrow along with his age mates from 2 other families. He hadn't had much experience with humans and then his family was on the run like everyone's. He'd learned more about their weapons than the people themselves. Adam, you'll be waiting outside, Ban said sternly as they approached the hall. Adam just nodded, understanding why he wasn't trusted. Ban had shown Henry respect, that should have been clue enough to be on his best behavior. As much as the other buck was singing the valley's praises, Adam had seen him kill humans. He'd done his own share alongside him on the road. Ban didn't trust easily or without reason. No matter what came later, the intention to be polite to get what they needed should have been clear. Adam shook his head once Ban looked away, displeased with himself. He wasn't the brightest, he knew that, but he usually didn't misstep so badly either. I'll make you some spring tea later, you might just need a bit extra, Jala offered quietly. Adam's ears drooped at that. Thank you, Adam said rather than argue. He hated the way it made him feel, but it was a necessity. The band couldn't afford more kits than it already had nor Buck's half mad with spring fever. Tella gave him a discreet pat on the arm after that and Adam's ears went completely limp. He'd rather she was still annoyed with him acting a fool than pitying him. At home the Bucks would compete in games to burn off the initial more savage rush of energy that spring brought. After they calmed a bit they'd have gone courting does. He'd seen his father and uncles go about it every season since he was old enough to remember, right until they had to run. Now Bucks drank tea and dealt with feeling like misery for a week to stave it off. A ritual Adam was going to have to undergo for the second time in a month lest his own fever bloom fully. Adam was shaken from his reminiscence by a change in the light. He hadn't been paying attention and found that the path they were on crossed through a patch of trees. They formed a canopy overhead and seemed to echo with the sound of a thin stream. It was a dark and cool place in contrast to the sun-baked path they'd been on earlier. The town had been like that too, full of greenery rather than stone or dirt. It was nice, probably his favorite thing about the place. He'd never cared for the villages his family had occasionally visited to sell herbs they'd gathered wild. When they emerged from the short tunnel it was to find a plan of narrow stretch of tall grass before a stretch of stone began and met with the valley's wall. Adam hardly took in the building before them, too surprised by the presence of 4 carts full of supplies. What's all of this? Dallin asked, sounding as surprised as Adam felt. Supplies for all of you, a soft high voice replied. The group all spun around, then had to look down. The speaker was a small halfling woman with pumpkin-colored eyes. She was well dressed in a cream tunic, puffy green pants, and a patchwork overcoat in bright hues. "Oh, hello. I'm Ban. I don't believe we've met," Ban said quickly, getting in front of the group to incline his head to the small woman. "I don't make many appearances," she offered in turn. "I'm Mirabella Fairburn, a librarian." "It's an honor to meet you," Ban replied. Adam almost asked what a librarian was, but checked the impulse before it got away from him. He wouldn't have meant any disrespect, but it likely would have sounded like he did. "Do come along, the mayor is expecting you," Mirabella said, then began to stride forward. Adam had wondered how she came up on them without them noticing before. The near silent footfalls explained it. They hadn't been able to hear her above the sound of the water. Mirabella led the way, and this time Adam actually looked at the building they were approaching. It was tall, with great glass windows starting rather high up, and huge doors. It was at once imposing and modest, not painted in a fancy way like the buildings in town. I'll just wait out here," Adam offered as they passed by the carts. They weren't guarded, and he didn't want to imply they needed to be. The mules for them were unhitched and feeding lazily on the grass nearby. "Look things over," he added a bit weakly. Ban nodded at him, seeming to appreciate him giving his own excuse. Mirabella paused, looking him over with a knowing hint of a smile. "You'll regret missing this, and I do believe the mayor would insist on your presence. So come along. You'll have plenty of time later to take stock of things," Mirabella countered, then resumed walking. Adam looked to Ban, who shrugged and gestured for him to join them as they followed the halfling woman into the building. The impression of modesty faded immediately when they entered the building. Once inside, Adam saw that the glass was far clearer than he'd expected. It had seemed milky from the outside due to the glare. He'd never seen anything quite like it. "Ban, welcome back," a somewhat low but carrying voice called out. Adam whipped around to find a woman taller than himself walking out of another set of doors. This one set into the risers that flanked the entryway. A hint of something like a storage room disappeared as she closed them. The woman looked pale until she stepped properly into the light. It was then that Adam could see that it was as if she was carved from snow, with faint shimmers of blue and silver to her rather than simply bloodless. Nothing about her spoke of ill health or frailty, just an otherness he associated with things like elementals. She even smelled different, like the wind on the edge of a storm. Rich with strangeness and the earth as it was first kissed by water. She strode forward to clasp Ban's wrist, and just how massive she was sunk in properly. "I'm so glad you're all here," she said excitedly. "I'm the mayor, Carant Du, but please call me Du if that's easier. These are members of my band, Jala, Tella, Dallin, and Adam." "Everyone, this is Mayor Du," Ban said, smoothing things over as everyone was caught off guard. Du had an imposing figure but a casual way of speaking that was a sharp contrast to her position. "Thank you for all the supplies, Mayor Du," Jala offered, the first to collect herself. "You're most welcome, though I'll need some guidance with the rest. I've gathered the basics for a group your size, but beyond that I don't really know what you need," Du said with a nod. "You intend to give us more?" Dallin asked, clearly shocked. "Yes, as I agreed to fully supply the band. I do hope you'll choose to stay," but Ban made it clear that was a decision to be made by the group, not him. "You'll need quite a bit more if you intend to leave after all," Du replied, tone still strangely light. She seemed to want them to stay but wasn't upset by the alternative prospect. Adam didn't know what to make of her, his grasp of the situation having shifted violently. In all honesty, Adam had expected to meet a tall woman, or possibly one with a bit of mixed ancestry. Ban had described her as giant's kin, but his words hadn't painted that vivid a picture for Adam. Now he could see why Getch and some of the others had suggested she might be an old guardian after talking more with Ban. Those had always been just stories to him, but now he could see why someone might believe them. "Well, forgive an old woman for her fears, but why be so generous to us? We've already brought you trouble once," Jala asked. Adam looked over at her, confused why she was the one starting trouble now. No matter the reason, the goal was to get the supplies. Questioning the woman's generosity wouldn't help with that. "Trouble?" Duex asked, tilting her head in confusion. "The Seekers," Jala said. Duex blinked heavily for a moment, then nodded, though she didn't speak. She looked like she was a little confused as she mulled the idea over. "It troubles you that I'd welcome your group knowing there might be future attacks," she mused, seemingly to herself. "Yes," Jala said simply. Well. To put it bluntly, that's an asset in my mind. This place isn't quite what you think, Duex began. She held up a hand and the stone of the floor rose up, the surface shifting to form what Adam realized was a tiny version of the valley rendered in stone. It even included the maze they'd passed through. I can manipulate things here to an extent. If you'll watch, Duex said, gesturing. The maze overtook the rest of the map, rendered in greater detail now. A clear path wound through the heart of it, but then a moment later it shifted. That path was blocked and all others led to winding dead ends. This is how the Seekers were dealt with, Du explained. So they died in the maze? Ban asked. Oh, yes, though not of natural causes. The dungeon has a main entrance that's heavily ensorcelled to prevent anything escaping. That isn't its only point of contact with the surface, however. By shifting the maze, I allowed the dungeon monsters to hunt the Seekers that night, Du said matter-of-factly. Why? Adam asked, feeling like he was going to vomit. A group that size pacifies the dungeon for a while, making it safer to explore from the main entrance, Du explained. And you're fine with that, feeding people to a horror like that? Adam demanded. A swift end is something of a mercy in its own right, though I don't imagine the Seekers deserved any. Killing is killing, and the dungeon creatures do it very efficiently, Du replied. Adam was stunned as he found he couldn't disagree despite being horrified. Furthermore, I'm a very simple person. I mean what I say and I often don't care about the same things others might. Who someone is, where they are from, what they are, that doesn't matter. Someone who comes in peace will be treated well, those with ill intent will be dealt with, Du said. So I'd like for you all to stay here, become citizens, but I'll understand if you're not interested, Du added, bowing her head for the first time. I'll be staying, Jala said bluntly, bowing stiffly. What? Ban asked, in shock. His words echoing everyone else's astonishment. What? She likes feeding Seekers to monsters. If that's her worst, then she's better than half the nobles my family ever suffered under, Jala said with a flash of teeth. The brewing argument was interrupted by a peal of laughter as loud as thunder that ended with a snuffling snort noise. You I like, Du said once her laughter subsided. Her grin revealed two sharp teeth as she patted Jala on the shoulder in a friendly way. Adam opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He really couldn't disagree, and going by everyone else's troubled expressions, neither could they. Chapter 182. Considerations. During the meeting, Ban had been rather stunned by Du's revelation about her ability. The way she used it, a little less so. He'd seen the maze manipulated when they were fleeing the Seekers. He'd also assumed they'd ended up dead at the time since more hadn't come. Even if they hadn't been able to find an easy way in, that lot wouldn't have given up. They'd have summoned more of their brethren and kept at it until they found a way. Ban didn't give a single shit about how they'd died. The only thing about the situation that bothered him was Du using her ability to access the dungeon. That set the hairs along his spine up. Killing is killing, and the dungeon creatures do it very efficiently, Du had said. As if the matter were simple. Ban shook his head, thoughts clouding it like flies. He'd walked through the town without managing to take much of it in. Now he was on the open road running along the river. His destination was one of the denser stands of trees. It wouldn't have been much of a set of directions, but with his sense of smell he hardly needed them. He'd scented Harry and Gretch as soon as they'd made it to a real road, and he'd been fighting the instinct to find her since. Now with the meeting over he was on their trail but hardly had a mind to take in anything else. There shouldn't really have been any doubts in his mind. A dungeon was an evil thing, and even if Du wasn't, it didn't change that they'd be living near one that didn't seem as contained as he'd assumed. It should have been a given that they'd politely thank the good mayor for her help and leave. Yet he couldn't convince himself of that path even without Jala's reaction mucking up things. I'll be staying, Jala had said in her blunt way. The old doe had even gone so far as to bow to Du. An elder was supposed to be wise, and she was old enough to have helped their mothers whelp them. Ban didn't know how he was supposed to argue with her, particularly when his heart wasn't in it. Maybe it was greed, but he liked the valley. It felt safer than he was accustomed to with its cliffs and friendly people. He also felt rather certain that even if Du wasn't an old guardian, she wasn't entirely different either. That if they agreed to live as citizens, she'd defend them. Why wasn't complicated? Du just seemed to be a poor liar and blunt, not to mention easily overwhelmed. He'd noticed it in how she dealt with him and the others when they first arrived. She liked to keep things simple. Using the valley and town as a trap for the unwary would have been anything but simple. He doubted Du would bother with a deception that required so much effort. That didn't mean he thought she was honest exactly. Just reasonably readable, which was almost better. She'd tell them what she wanted, possibly even why, and didn't mind doing what was needful to achieve her goals. She wanted citizens, so she'd be kind to them. Perhaps less so once they committed to living there, but he hadn't noticed any of the townsfolk wanting for anything important. They'd only really seemed to want a bit of conversation and news of the world outside the valley. Caught up in his thoughts, Ban was already straying off into the trees before he realized how close he was to his destination. He all but stumbled out of a bush and into the small clearing in front of the burrow. "There's the brat now," Gretch said merrily. "Ban!" Harry called cheerfully. She was covered from the tip of her ears to her toes in dirt. He had her swept up in his arms in a hug before he realized he'd even started moving. "Missed you, darlin'," Ban said, giddy with relief at seeing her. He didn't even mind Gretch giving him a wallop with her stick for it. A sore backside was a small price to pay and it had been a light hit. "Missed you too," Harry said brightly. She wiggled her nose against his affectionately. The second more serious wallop from Gretch convinced him to put her down. "Got it, I'll be good," Ban said playfully. He definitely wasn't going to apologize, though he'd keep his word. "How was the meeting?" Gretch asked. Ban was caught flat-footed, though he should have expected as much. Gretch already had her reunion with Harry done with. Cutting his short wouldn't seem that important in comparison to knowing what happened. "It went, generally fine," Ban offered haltingly. There was no succinct summary of what had gone on, so he went ahead and told them the story from the start when Adam made an ass of himself with Henry through to the meeting. Harry looked as shocked as Ban had felt, sitting down on a tree stump to think. Gretch though looked thoughtful but not terribly surprised. "You see this coming?" Ban asked. He couldn't think of another reason she could be so calm. "God's boy, no. How would I have?" Gretch demanded. She looked at him like his brain had fallen out of his ear. "You just don't seem that surprised," Ban said quickly. "I'm not, because I came expecting magic, and magic always means chaos of one kind or another," Gretch said with a heavy sigh. She gestured at the trees around them. "The place is heavy with it, you don't get plants like this in a desert otherwise. Takes strong earth and water mana to sustain them when nature can't," she added. "Oh. I just assumed it was because of the river," Ban admitted. That earned him another look like he was brainless. "Along the banks, sure, but it's too low to flood like would be needed to sustain all this," Gretch pointed out. Ban just nodded, not wanting to put his foot in his mouth again. He hadn't thought of it, but that did make sense. "Jala really said she means to stay?" Harry asked. "Obviously, so do I," Gretch said with a harumph. "What? Why?" Ban asked, doubly confused. "I'm too old to go into the trackless wilderness like some mad yearling. I hardly made it here. I'd just slow the lot of you down if it came to that, which I won't do," Gretch said as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Artem means to go," Ban countered. The weight of the words were already settling uncomfortably in his gut. His legs are still good, and he's an idiot. He probably thinks he'll be able to finish training up someone to replace him before he dies. "Best we pass on what we can hear and let the young folks do what they want," Gretch finished. Gran Harry started to interject only to be silenced by an upraised hand. "I've spoken my bit, now you two talk amongst yourself. Though keep in mind I'll geld you lad if you take liberties," Gretch warned. "I've had my tea," Ban said, hands up in surrender. The tea didn't prevent everything, but it would keep him from acting senseless. "Good," Gretch said, getting up with some trouble. She glared at Harry but allowed to let her help her to her feet anyway. She even gave her a fond pat before turning and heading for the road. Watching her slow, uneven steps, Ban couldn't deny she had a point about her condition and Jala wasn't much better. The Ban's elders certainly weren't in ideal condition for an expedition of any kind, even without seekers after them. "I'm staying if she is," Harry said immediately, a hard look in her eyes. She'd lost her mother early and Gretch had raised her. Ban wasn't surprised by her choice despite the situation. "All right, I wasn't really keen on going either. If the rest of the band chooses to go, we can look after the elders here until they find a place to settle," Ban said after a moment. "There's my smart buck," Harry said, hugging him this time. Harry's choice had made his own, he wouldn't leave her. Still, it wasn't a sacrifice of any kind. If anything, he was grateful for her decisiveness. Chapter 183. Debate. Though Ban had reached his own decision, a band meeting needed to happen. One that he put off for as long as reasonable to let everyone have a chance to go into the valley and see it properly themselves. Artem hadn't been happy about it. The old greyhide had wanted to push for an immediate decision so no one would have time for first thoughts, let alone second. Thankfully none of the other elders had been on his side about that, even though they'd expressed agreement with his plan. Haste wasn't in their nature if they weren't forced into it. It couldn't and shouldn't be put off forever though. A month had passed since they'd first arrived, and the time had come to discuss their future properly. The walk to the encampment wasn't hard, but it was bleak. The wind whistled through the barren foothills, carrying with it the scent of the valley below. He couldn't help but look back, drawn to the lush greenery and the glimmer of the river in the distance. Behind him the camp was a hive of hushed activity. The group of sturdy tents was comfortable but obviously impermanent. The hills were too rocky and the soil wrong for digging even temporary burrows. Still, no one had complained. They'd even gone so far as to praise the provisions Du had provided. Particularly the food. Even as he walked toward the band, his thoughts were in the valley and the burrow Harry had dug with her own paws. He'd been splitting time between the two and knew the tents couldn't compare. There was a rightness to being able to dig in and sleep in the earth's embrace that he hadn't expected. Gretch had laughed at him when he'd mentioned it, but not unkindly. It was just the natural way of their kind after all. Something he hadn't had a chance to experience properly in far too long. Despite the decision they were going to discuss, no one looked at him warily. Opinions might differ, but they were kin and kind no matter what else came to pass. They were all already gathered around the central fire, chatting amongst themselves. They didn't stop on his account, but some of the younger does around Harry playfully flashed teeth at him, as if warding off an unwanted spring fever suitor for her. Ban would have preferred to sit with her, but as band leader it was his place to sit between them and the elders. As if his mediation would be more than a token. No hard decisions had been made yet, but nobody wanted to leave soon, and that meant Artem's plans were essentially sunk for the foreseeable future. Going by the way the elder was just shy of pouting with his ears half down, he seemed to know it too. All right, we all know why we're here this evening, and I'm sure you've all discussed things amongst yourselves. Ban started as soon as he took his place. Standing up to address everyone was about as formal as things ever got at such gatherings. To start with, does anyone want to leave the valley soon? I mean inside of the next month or sooner? Ban asked, getting straight to the heart of things. No hands went up nor calls of agreement. It was the heavy silence of disinterest rather than an uneasy one of uncertainty. All right, living arrangements can be discussed later then, as well as plans for what everyone will be doing, Ban said, relieved. He hadn't been sure there would be full agreement. It wasn't the only thing they had to talk about still, but it was a relief it was done with so easily. Why bother? Everyone wants to be that monster woman's kept pet, Artem said bitterly. Manners, Gretch said tightly. She even menaced Artem with her stick for a moment. What? Am I wrong? Grateful as I am, this must be a trap if she has any sort of connection to the dungeon. We should get out with what we can now, before the jaw spring closed, Artem said. Ban closed his eyes for a moment. He'd expected something like it to come up, it hadn't been far from his own thoughts in darker moments. Why would she wait? Ban asked. What? Artem asked, surprised. It's true that she's strange, and that connection bothers me too. Still, there isn't a reason to be as honest as she has if all she wanted was to kill us. It would have been as easy as having me lead you all in through the maze, Ban explained. It was the end of all of his less paranoid lines of thought as he'd mulled things over. I won't pretend to know everything, but I can't think of a reason for her to put so much effort into a lie she needn't bother with in the first place, he added. You can't prove she thinks like us. She might be mad, Artem said. She clearly doesn't, and perhaps that's madness, but I'll take someone who isn't moved by gold or hate over a sane lord from Stronghold any day, Ban countered. Artem nodded grudgingly at that. Even people who didn't share Stronghold's hatred could be moved to report them by the bounties that thrice accursed kingdom offered. May I move on? Ban asked. Artem nodded and the other elders joined in, giving approval for the topic change. Now, it's early to ask, but does anyone think they might want to settle here for a while? Meaning at least the next few years? Ban asked. Some hands went up at that, but less than half of the band, and the group was mixed. Most of the elders raised theirs, which seemed to surprise Artem. Ban wanted to sigh at that, he'd likely been complaining too much to listen. He wasn't the only surprised one though. Most of the younger band members looked shocked. Ban supposed not all of the elders were as straightforward as Jala and Gretch. They might have needed more time to think it over. Who'd like to try and see about the lands beyond the mountain? Ban asked. A fair number of bucks raised their hands, which he'd expected. All right, seems to me the best plan is to take advantage of this place and what it has to offer fully then. Anyone who wants can stay here and camp, but if you want to move into the valley, there are burrows waiting and good land for making a few more, Ban started. That caused some murmurs. It was one thing to talk about it as a future possibility, another to be faced with the reality that they could do so as soon as morning if they wanted. Do consider apprenticing or taking jobs though. Maybe learning to read, they've got a school for it and the mayor says we're welcome. Learn things you need to know while you can, we might not get another opportunity like this if we do end up leaving, he continued once the voices died down. Those who want to find a way across and explore the other side of the mountain, I'd suggest going and taking a look at the adventuring school. I went and it turns out I know a sight less about bushcraft than I thought I did. Get the skills you need, be ready when the time comes, Ban added. There was a thunder of drumming feet at that, the bucks in full agreement. Enough of that, Ban said laughing. It died slowly, their excitement high. Did anyone have concerns or questions? Is it really a good idea to live in the valley? I find the people in the town strange, Tella asked. She was a little timid most times and shrank under the attention of the group, but held her ground. Strange how? Ban asked. Not because he disagreed, but because the list of how the various citizens were odd was longer than his forearm. Tella wilted further, looking to Jala pleadingly. They aren't unkind. It's like they've never lived anywhere else yet all of them seem to be from strange places, Jala explained. Ban nodded, having caught that himself. I honestly don't understand that either. They are mostly adventurers, but I couldn't tell you how they got here and the only thing approaching an answer I've ever gotten is that the mayor asked them to come, Ban admitted. Have you tried asking the mayor? Gretch inquired. No, it seemed, rude I suppose, Ban admitted. It was also a thought that had only crossed his mind fleetingly on random occasions. How the places the various people of the town talked about sounded more foreign than he could account for. Well, she'll be here soon. You can ask her then, Gretch added. Oh, all right. Ban caught what she'd said a moment late. Wait, why will she be here? Ban asked as his brain caught up. I invited her, once the moon is a finger above the maze, Gretch replied calmly. And you did that why? Artem asked, ears straight up in shock. Should we not include her so we can ask her questions? I can't imagine anyone else knowing more about what's going on than her, Gretch replied placidly. Ban let out a groan. It made sense but it was something that should have been agreed to by everyone. Having do come when they hadn't even fully discussed the matter between themselves was asking for trouble. You really think the mayor will come out to a place like this just because you invited her? Artem asked with a derisive snort. Nobody else was as openly rude about it, but doubting looks were exchanged all the same. Du was an important person, she had no reason to accommodate them when she could easily summon them if she needed. I do, Gretch replied without even a hint of concern. Look a fool then, Artem said. Bet on it? Gretch asked. Sure, whatever you want, Artem agreed. The lady wins, a voice that sent everyone's hair standing on end resonated in the night air. The camp was immediately on alert, but they didn't need to look for long. Duex was standing in the road leading up to the camp, silver hair glinting in the moonlight. How the fuck is someone your size that quiet? Dallin demanded in surprise. Jala cuffed him on the ear but Du just laughed. Chapter 184. Stirring the pot. I didn't do a lot of walking normally, but I decided to stroll up to the Lepusans' camp on foot. The evening was a pretty one, the sky clear as the sun set and the first hint of stars appeared. I arrived during a tense exchange and waited on the road, not wanting to intrude. Bet on it? Gretch asked. She'd invited me and fully believed I'd come. Smart lady. Sure, whatever you want, Artem said, agreeing to the bet. I hadn't been looking for a dramatic entrance, but when handed one, who was I to say no? The lady wins, I called out. When Gretch had invited me up to the camp, I'd thought it was for an informal hello. A chance to show my face to some of the Lepusan who I hadn't seen yet. Going by the way they were all sitting around the fire and looking at me tensely, that clearly wasn't what happened. How the fuck is someone your size that quiet, one of them demanded. I laughed at that, a snorting undignified kind of laugh. Very sorry, he'll be punished, Jala offered. For what? It's fine, I said, waving it off. That's kind of you, Ban said, bowing a bit to me. I wasn't the biggest fan of that. Not because of the gesture itself, just that it seemed to be something he only really did around me. I don't enjoy being insulted or rude behavior, but you don't need to tiptoe around me. That cuffing was punishment enough, I offered. That got me looks of confusion. I supposed that in a normal hierarchy a mayor was someone to be careful of. I wasn't interested in using power for asinine reasons like ego, but they didn't know that. It was something I'd have to prove through my actions rather than simply my words. Right, Thank you, Ban said. He looked as awkward as I felt. So, you all have questions? I asked. Well, Ban hesitated. It seemed like they hadn't had enough time to talk amongst themselves. We certainly do, Artem said hotly, voice dripping with annoyance. All right. I'm Du, the mayor, who might you be? I asked. He was one of the elders who I'd only seen at a distance when observing the encampment. He hadn't come down into the valley even once. Introductions were in order. Artem said stiffly. He stood up but still had to crane his neck to look me in the eyes properly. I don't trust you and it's foolish to stay here. I waited for a beat as a heavy silence descended in the wake of those words. Everyone around us seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Well, that was a statement, not a question. To reply, very well to your first point. We've only just met, it would be strange if you trusted me much. To the second, I disagree, I offered. Pockets of laughter bubbled up at that before spreading. It didn't last long, but there was a palpable relief of tension in the camp. That's not a real answer. Artem said, visibly annoyed. You still haven't asked a question, Ban offered and the laughter renewed for a moment. Artem looked like he was going to say something, but Jala tugged on his arm. He glared at her, but she glared back and he lost the staring contest after a moment and sat down. You planning to stop us if we go exploring the mountain, one of the younger bucks called out. I hadn't caught his name and as others sitting near him echoed the question I decided against asking. No, though I'm curious why it interests you, I said honestly. I didn't own all of it yet, but I was working on it. The parts nearest the valley were difficult to climb, and I planned to make them a bit more difficult once I did. I liked making sure the valley's more natural-looking defenses were top-notch. None of your business, Artem said sharply. Gretch gave him a thump on the arm with her stick. We want to find a way across, into the wilderness, Atun said. I recalled the young buck having been rude to Henry, but he'd paid for it at the time. It also seemed like he'd taken the general lesson to heart. Artem shot him a glare but he didn't seem to mind. That was a plan being discussed, for later, Ban confirmed. I mulled that over in my head for a moment. I honestly didn't know much about the other side of the mountain myself. Well, I'm not saying you can't explore the mountain if you want to, but if it's just getting to the other side that interests you, there's a passage, I admitted. Really? Ban asked, clearly shocked. Yeah, that's where the farms we get most of the food for the valley are. We can grow some things here, but not that much honestly, I explained. We could grow more in the valley than we should have been able to, but I hadn't felt like pushing plausibility too far. I thought you used magic, Tella said. The doe was too surprised to be nervous for a moment. It has limits, I countered, but not unkindly. Interestingly, most of the Lepusan I could see seemed rather relieved to hear that. A murmur of conversation started up and I didn't try to stop it or insert myself. They'd just learned some rather important things in a very short span. How much do you know about it? The other side of the mountain, I mean, Ban asked. Not much. We've never encountered anyone who lives there that wasn't a transplant from the valley. It's just forest as far as the eye can see beyond the farms and I don't know how seriously to take the old maps, I explained. Old maps? Ban asked, clearly intrigued. They aren't particularly accurate and call this mountain range the Shield and the lands beyond it the Demon Kingdom, I explained. No such map existed but it was true that the area was designated as such in the system. All conversation died and Ban looked at me in wide-eyed shock. The Demon Kingdom? Ban asked. Like I said, I don't know if they should be taken seriously, I reminded him. I knew nothing much about demons other than they existed and Demon Lord had been a job choice open to me. They might be like any other people with shades of grey and normal objectives. Demons might also be more like dungeon creatures serving their demon lord. Or some blend of the two. I really didn't know and was reluctant to say more. More murmuring went up and I just waited for the band to talk it out. If any of that is true, then show us the way through, Artem demanded. In the morning I'll gladly do so, I offered. I could have taken them immediately using light stones to navigate, but it seemed like a bad idea to me. Having them wandering about in a strange place in the dark would invite trouble. Getting back to the main question. I've no objection to anyone leaving, though I'd suggest caution and that you bring more of your people with you, I offered. Surviving on the run, this was a large group, but if you mean to settle in a foreign land you are going to need numbers, I added. It had been difficult for them, smaller groups were more agile and less resource intensive. Still, relocating somewhere undeveloped would require manpower. Even factoring that they were stronger than humans and could dig burrows, they likely would need more hands to really make a new settlement work in the long term. In the meantime, you're welcome here, I finished. There was a drumming of feet in agreement or approval of that. Everyone started talking amongst themselves again, but the tone was different, more upbeat. Ban also left his spot and came over to me. I think we're going to need to discuss this for a while, Ban said, casting an amused look at the rest of the band. Makes sense, I replied, unbothered. May I walk you back? Ban asked. I almost laughed. It was a nice gesture but I was pretty sure he just didn't want me to add fuel to the fire with more unexpected revelations. I couldn't blame him though, they already had a lot to think about. Certainly, I agreed. The full moon was enough light to see by and the path was clear so we were making good time, but neither of us was in a hurry. About earlier, I actually don't plan to go into the wilderness. Harry and I will be staying with Gretch, Ban said after a while. You're welcome to do so, I said. I wanted numbers but I'd have been lying if I said there weren't Lepusen that I particularly wanted to stay. He was familiar and level-headed in my experience. I thought you might say that, but I wanted to let you know, Ban offered. We were coming up on the town proper. Noted, and here is good. I'll be fine the rest of the way, I said. I didn't mind the walk but I'd be teleporting back to the dungeon once I was alone. Good night then, and thank you, Ban said, giving me a small bow. I returned it and watched him head back up the path into the foothills. With the thought I was back in my palace of shadows and finally allowed myself a happy dance. I had confirmed residence.